on this sheet, you all saw some diversity and inclusion panel discussions that we're having here as well. Keep those in mind. We sit at the 9th Street Divide, so a lot of important conversations are going on here. I'm Rachel Platt, the Director of Community Engagement here at the Frazier History Museum. We thank you all so much for coming. I was going around trying to figure out many of your connections to Hunter and what brought you out here tonight. We want this very much to be a discussion and want your input and your questions as well. And lucky me, I got to call some of my buddies and bring them in. My former TV husband, Bernson, is helping me co-moderate tonight. Of course, it's a salute to Hunter S Thompson, a native of Louisville, from GONZO journalism, so we're going to be talking a lot about that. Tonight's discussion, I think a lot of you all had a chance to look around part of our Freak Power exhibit when he ran for sheriff in Pitkin County in Aspen, Colorado in 1969. So a lot of it is based on that and very much the political world. So we are going to start though with an ad that takes us back to 1969.
Hunter Thompson is a moralist posing as an immoralist. Nixon is an immoralist disguised as a moralist. This is James Salter. There'll be thieves and autorecs in Aspen, whoever gets elected. But Hunter represents something wholly alien to the other candidates for sheriff. Ideas. And a sympathy towards the young, generous, grass-oriented society, which is making the only serious effort to face the technological nightmare we have created. The only thing against him is he's a visionary. He wants too pure a world.
All right, so we'll decide if how much of what was said back then still applies today. So I want to also, we're going to introduce everybody on the panel, and at least one person on this panel said Hunter S. Thompson was prophetic. So we're going to be talking about that. Why don't you get us started in introducing the panel?
Absolutely. The person who said Hunter S. Thompson is prophetic is Dr. Roorda, political science professor.
Which one of us was that? I thought we all
You characterize yourself as a big fan of HST, all right. And you used Hunter's writings one semester for a course on U.S. history, which I find very interesting. So he'll be talking more about that as we go on.
All right, raise your hand, Tom. Eblen joining us. We wanted an array of voices tonight, a former columnist from the Lexington Herald-Leader.
Pam Platt is with us. Yes, she is Rachel's sister. So she works for about the same amount of money that we all do tonight.
She's got socks.
I have to declare that on my taxes. Pam's a former editorial writer for the Courier-Journal, which is a newspaper that used to exist.
Nice. No slings and arrows tonight.
Why not?
Not for our panel.
And also a winner on Jeopardy about a year and a half ago.
More James category. I think you have 2 nights though, right?
I won one, lost one.
Okay,
Yeah,
sorry.
that's not good.
I was trying to, overindulge. All right, Mark Hebert, now at the University of Louisville, but a former political reporter for how many years at HAS TV? I should know this.
22 at HAS, 27 overall.
Okay, very good.
Also, we're joined by Stephen George, president of Louisville Public Media, to which I contribute a very large sum of money every year.
So before we get going on the discussion, I kind of wanted everybody to talk about their first introductions to Hunter S. Thompson. So let's start with you.
I guess first I was a subscriber to Rolling Stone back in the day, and started to see his work there. And Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, the book that started in Rolling Stone, is still the funniest book I have ever read. I mean, I couldn't breathe reading that book. And it introduced me, as it did to millions of other people, a style of journalism that centered around the writer. I don't know what Hunter would have done in television with that same approach. It's kind of interesting to think what he would have done as a columnist for CBS Sunday Morning, let's say, or some other, maybe on CNN as a kind of a wild man. But it occurred to me many, many years later that every culture has a trickster, has somebody who pokes the balloon and, brings the mighty down, if you will. And I think that's what Hunter Thompson was for our culture in the 60s, remembering that he came of age at the same time as James Dean, when American teenagerhood was sort of being invented in the 1950s. and diverging from, it was supposed to be just a model of what your parents had created, but in the 50s, James Dean, Hunter Thompson, others, many others, started to diverge and create a teenage culture, and I think it's that grew into what he became. So it was Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas that got me started.
That was your book.
Yep.
Mr. Hebert.
I think, I'm much younger than Barry.
This is going to be a nasty one.
We used to work together. I'm clearly on this panel because I'm the eye candy other than Pam. Because I am not a huge fan of Hunter S Thompson. Fear and Loathing was an interest for me, and that's how I got to know Hunter S Thompson a little bit, but I was not one of those that would go out of my way to read him and look for things written by him. I thought he was a terrific writer. Fear and Loathing was, it still is one of the most hilarious books, but I never really, I'm going to diverge, I think, from this panel when we get talking. I never really considered him a true journalist because I'm old school. And I never really considered him a journalist. I considered, like Barry said, he wrote a lot in the first person. And it was very reporter-centric, it was journalist-centric, Hunter-centric. And so I never really thought of him like I was as a journalist. I loved his character on Doonesbury. That was, for many of us, I think, growing up, an entrance into the mind, perhaps, not just Gary Trudeau, but of Hunter S. Thompson as well. So I'm looking forward to this discussion about what would Hunter Thompson think about the current political field today.
I think we know.
All right, Tom.
Well, I became acquainted with his work also through Rolling Stone. I was reading Rolling Stone, and summer before I started Western Kentucky University, I had been editor of my high school paper, and I was getting ready to start Western, and I was all excited about being a journalist. And I remember starting to read his work in Rolling Stone, and particularly the piece he did, I think it was in June that summer before I started, about basically endorsing Jimmy Carter for president based on having attended this kind of kick-ass speech he gave at the University of Georgia Law School. And it was just kind of like a piece of journalism. I'd never really read writing like that. And so that kind of prompted me to read more of his. And then one of my professors at Western was a guy named Bill McKean, who was a very young professor then, who later went on to the University of Florida and Indiana, is now at Boston University, and wrote 2 biographies of Thompson, along with several other books. So he's somebody whose career I followed. I'm kind of like Mark, though, in being a rather old school journalist. I don't really consider him a journalist, but I consider him a very talented writer and such a kind of a unique personality in terms of kind of how he reflected culture and how he influenced culture. And it's just a real kind of a one-of-a-kind character. And, the one thing about journalists is we love characters. And, and he was certainly one.
Eric?
It's great you should mention Jimmy Carter. I was just thinking today about how there's a kind of Jimmy Carter vibe around Mayor Pete, the judge, who today in an address in Bloomington said, normal is broken, which echoes the quotation right over there about how Hunter S. Thompson wore the label of freak with pride, then formed a whole party and a movement around that idea that normal is broken. I don't think he's a journalist either. I think he's a lot closer to Mark Twain. He's the Twain of the 20th century. I'll get into that later, because Rachel tipped her hand and told me that she was going to ask me about my exposure to Hunter S. Thompson, how I got into him, and so I asked her if he wrote an essay. Just a real quick one. I wanted to get it right, though, and so it's called A Terrible Role Model, My Life with Hunter S. Thompson. Now, I'm a Eisenhower baby, barely. My birth preceded the military-industrial complex speech by a little less than 24 hours. I grew up fast in the 60s because I had these, and I'm talking about the 60s with, you spell it with the peace sign, as a big dot over the I, because those started about 1964, they didn't end about 1973. The 60s, I'm not talking about the decade of the 60s, the 60s. And so I grew up fast in the 60s because I had these three older siblings who by 69 were full-out hippies. And so one brother, much older, who managed to make a career out of being an outlaw biker. He just quite recently retired as the editor of Independent Biker, Harley Davidson's freebie that they give away at their dealerships. I was inducted into the Motorcycle Hall of Fame in, where else? Las Vegas. And so he was a charter subscriber to Rolling Stone magazine, which I read too when it came to the house. And then when it rolled off the presses in 1971, he brought home a copy of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. I read that too. I thought it was hilarious, even at the age of 10 in 5th grade. I took it to class at school. Fortunately, I live in East Lansing, Michigan. And it was a hippy-dippy, progressive elementary school. And the teacher thought that was really cool and passed it around so the kids could look at the funny pictures.
What the parents think.
Yeah, well, the kids were all, children of Michigan State faculty, and so they didn't care. But when my family then uprooted to go to Youngstown, Ohio, we called it Y-Town. Why does this town exist? In Ohio, which I'm sure you know from listening to Devo that it's a joke that sounds like a riddle. Round the end, behind the middle, right? And so that's when I learned that GONZO was not appropriate. The talk of drug culture and pointedly atrocious behavior was not appropriate, and so I took it upon myself to bring GONZO to Campfield, Ohio, a stifling village. And as the editor of the high school newspaper, I tried to bring GONZO into the newspaper, and the principal burned 1,000 copies of the first time we tried to go GONZO rather than let it circulate. So we started an independent newspaper and sold it off campus. We sold it in the grocery stores, and the housewives bought it at the Value King. It was called Blows Against the Empire, from a Paul Cantor Jefferson Airplane reference. And it was good. We actually had interviews with Frank Shorter, the Olympic medalist in 1972, and Jim Trafficant, who became outrageous as a representative from that
Go to jail.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. And this is a very early interview with the corrupt Jim Trafficant. So I guess that was a kind of journalism that was inspired by Thompson. And then college.
We got to keep going now.
Yeah. And so that is what. And from there, it just kept going until reaching college and reaching the point of teaching in college and assigning these books in classes because they make such unique points.
All right, hold on to your essay. We're going to get
That's the end of it.
Oh.
That's it. No,
Oh,
I just
okay.
paraphrased it.
I was waiting for you to
You
read
didn't need
it.
to tell them.
No, that's
You did
it.
not need to tell it over at
No,
all.
you're perfect. You came on right.
All right.
This is it ended.
Mr. George.
I think I was a freshman in high school right around there when I first read Hunter Thompson, and it was Hell's Angels. And I started it, and I kind of got burned out on it, and didn't finish it. And a few months later was introduced to Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. Tore through that in a night. I just stayed up. I mean, it was so gripping, so different, so radical, and it inspired me to go back to Hell's Angels, right? And then I started to explore this idea in my own head of what Hunter Thompson's relationship to journalism was, because I do think he was a journalist, and I think he was responding in a lot of ways to what he saw as the fault lines in traditional journalism at the time, and trying to get at truth rather than objectivity, which I think is a really interesting sort of through line in all of his work. Anyway, I came back to Hell's Angels, and it at the time I was kind of playing around with what I wanted to do and be, and how my identity and my work might end up working together and all this. Anyway, it he inspired me to be a journalist, really because I wanted to be a writer and knew that I couldn't get paid unless I did journalism, right? Which was like a thing that he, very early on, like the sort of lead up to Rum Diary and all that stuff, right? Like he's working as a journalist in San Juan, and he's got the novel in the bottom drawer and all that, right? I really grabbed onto that whole sort of personal narrative and exploration of journalism as a career and ideal. And so I really credit, Hell's Angels to me is a work of journalism, very clearly. And so I credit that book with sort of my interest in journalism at all.
And a very personal, are we going to share now?
Well, when I was 18, I got a tattoo of it's the Freak Power, like the poster out here, when he was running for sheriff with the double thumb, double thumb fist, the peyote button, and the sheriff's badge and back. I know we'll get into this. I always really liked Hunter's serious stuff, like his political stuff, and I always really thought that he was always striving to be taken seriously as a thinker and an analyst and a political commentator and a journalist. And the thing that bothered me about Fear and Loathing was the caricature. Really not in the book, but what followed the caricature of him.
It seems like he almost became that character.
Well,
in response to what he had written.
He was, quite literally a cartoon. And I think that's a disservice to the word. And so anyway, I have it right here. It's 18 years old. Got the,
You were serious stuff. All right, Pam, how about you?
I don't have a tattoo, but I will say it was Rolling Stone, Rolling Stone, Rolling Stone. And it was also a very exciting time in the 1970s to read these writers. And he was one of them. I remember reading an article in Rolling Stone, and it may have been about a Muhammad Ali fight where he never left his hotel room and covered it better than everybody else. And he talked about all these celebrities who came and he saw, and he wrote about Liza Minnelli's false eyelashes looking like hog bristles. And that always stuck with me. I thought that is like the best description. And he always nailed it with that. And that was a time when Rex Reed, who's now kind of considered a joke, he was a very fine writer, was this new journalism. And he wrote about Lucille Ball's being the color of an orange popsicle. And Tom Wolfe, and what he did in his articles in Rolling Stone, and Nora Ephron, and just all of these great people. It was very, very exciting. And so Hunter Thompson was part of my stew of that, and sort of, I raced out and bought Rolling Stone all the time, and I dated a sweet, sweet boy who loved Hunter Thompson, and he always wore this t-shirt that said the curse of Lono, and I never knew who that was. And he and his best friend called each other Rono all the time, and we still use that as an expression. I think he is a journalist. I think he's a truth teller. I think he's a patriot. I think he's all of these things. He has all of these arrows in his quiver, and he would pull out any one of them when he needed it. I think it's really sad what he became later on. There are some dangers to doing drugs and with abandon. But I think he was great, and I want to get back to Stephen's point at some point. I pulled up the piece he wrote about the obituary he wrote for Richard Nixon,
I just put that.
which I posted on Facebook the other day. I don't remember reading this. He wrote it in 1994, and it is the most powerful, muscular, eviscerating piece. And I just imagine, just take Nixon out, put Trump in, and imagine what he would write with this guy today. But he writes about objectivity and should he be using these words in this piece. And he makes a very good argument about why it has to do with what Stephen said, that the objective rules let somebody like Nixon get by, and that you have to get subjective at some point, which reminds me of another saying of his, which I really like, and once had a t-shirt that said, when the going gets weird, the weird turn pro. And I think we need to do that again.
So before Barry asks one question, I'm just curious because it seems like the panel is a little bit split here on journalist or not. In the audience, who thinks he was a journalist?
Can you say sometimes?
That's
Yes.
He was with Hells Angels,
Yeah.
but I don't think the bulk of his career was spent as a journalist. But he did do journalism.
And who would say no? Just out of curiosity. Okay, go ahead, Bernson. I was just curious because when we said that, it was kind of split up here.
Yeah. And maybe it doesn't matter what label you put on Hunter S. Thompson, because today, in the current political atmosphere that we all live in, we have columnists and commentators who are as opinionated, certainly, as Hunter Thompson was. But I think they would proudly also carry the label journalist. I don't think because you have an opinion, that necessarily excuses you from the ranks of journalists.
I think you're right about that. I guess I think in some ways he was a journalist. Where I kind of put him in a different category is that a lot of his writing was more about him than the story.
No question.
And that, and when you even compare him to some of the other new journalists like, Tom Wolfe, who was just an amazing reporter, and some other, and Nora Ephraim and some of these others that it was just a different, he was different from that, and I almost put him more in the category of just kind of a writer, although he wrote a lot of journalism. He just wrote a lot of it.
Yeah, I thought he's a terrific writer, but in this, maybe we'll give this away to somebody, Steve, after this. My buddy Steve Shaw gave me this collector's edition GONZO, the life and work of Hunter S. Thompson. I watched it over the last couple of days, and one of the people in this said, I think it was George McGovern that was quoted in this as saying something to the effect of, he did some great journalism, he did some great work, but then he went into fantasy, and sometimes you couldn't draw the line as which was which. And so I thought that was kind of an interesting way of putting it, but he said he loved the way that he covered politics, and even Pat Buchanan was talking about Hunter Thompson in this thing, and was talking about how he covered Nixon and stuff, and said that, he always thought he was fair. What did he say? He was out there, but he was fair, or something along those lines.
Yeah, why don't you read that with Nixon, because we're talking politics. So let's
Well,
read
if
it.
you all haven't read it, you need to find it. The Atlantic reprinted it. It originally ran in Rolling Stone.
And Pam put it on Facebook.
I did
Pam's
put it on,
Facebook.
and I'll make it public so everybody
And
can
the
see it. So
title
you don't have
says
to
it
go.
all.
Huh?
The title says it all.
I can't remember the title, but
He was a crook.
he was a crook.
So
He
this
was a
was
crook.
in what year?
94. He wrote it like a couple days after Nixon died. Anyway, so I pulled this from the piece because I thought this was exactly right. Some people will say that words like scum and rotten are wrong for objective journalism, which is true, but they miss the point. It was the built-in blind spots of the objective rules and dogma that allowed Nixon to slither into the White House in the first place. He looked so good on paper that you could almost vote for him sight unseen. He seemed so all-American, so much like Horatio Alger, that he was able to slip through the cracks of objective journalism. You had to get subjective to see Nixon clearly, and the shock of recognition was almost painful.
All right, Stephen, react to that, and we'll...
I've probably read that piece 3 or 4 times. I adore that piece. He also writes that Nixon was so crooked that he had to have an aide screw his pants on in the morning.
That was my favorite one.
I think he's totally right. I mean, you see journalists now at the New York Times and the Washington Post struggling with this conundrum, which is how to fairly assess a public figure who kind of blows up what's normal or pushes so far beyond the boundaries you're used to that you don't have a mechanism to evaluate. I think that's a spot-on analysis. I was not alive at the time. I wasn't certainly consuming the news of the day, but I think there's some pretty clear parallels to what we're seeing today. There's this, I think it was a year and a half or so ago, you might remember, the New York Times put a piece by Michael Barbara, who's now the host of The Daily, if you ever listened to that. He covered the Republican campaign trail in the 2016 election. And they put a piece of his on the front page of the New York Times on the right rail, and it was labeled analysis, and he called Trump a liar, or say lie, or something like that. And it blew up, right? How can the New York Times put a piece of subjective opinion journalism on its front page? How can he use a word like liar, which implies intent, and on and on? This isn't, I say this only to say that this is still something that we're struggling with today, is how to fairly, if not objectively, analyze a public figure.
When you talk about being prophetic and somebody really being a prophet, I mean, you go around on these walls and you read stuff that he wrote or that was written about him, and you close your eyes and it could be today. And this, I think, is absolutely what's going on today with how people are covering, and he is a liar. And, you know, and you have to call things what they are. And sometimes, you know, Hunter Thompson would get a little crazy in doing that, but I think even when he made things up in his stories about, you know, did he really, you know, vomit all over his shoes? I don't know. But I think he ultimately tried to find the truth in what he wrote. And I think he told the truth. And anyway, this is stunning to find something like this.
Yeah.
Eric, you used the word prophet. Tell me what you think he was most prophetic about.
All right. In the Rum Diary, take it chronologically, he was prophetic about how tourism development would ruin the Caribbean and other places around the world. And in Hell's Angels is basically a case study of sociopathic tribalism that I think foreshadows the low-grade warfare that's being carried out now by the cyber hate groups and the gun violence psychopaths that surround us. In A Southern City with Northern Problems, he was prophetic about how Louisville's housing segregation would still be profound in the future. Except he was a little off in that race relations have gotten a lot worse. In Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, I think, and incidentally, if you Google fear, just the word fear, the third option is Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. So he foresaw that lawyers, law enforcement, media, and professional sports would dominate the carnival of largesse and mutual suspicion and contempt that is America. You know,
There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with it.
You'd be the judge of that. You're probably better able to make that judgment. And in the truly prophetic on Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail 72, he saw that the primary system would be, 72 was the first year that the state primaries were really paramount in selecting the nominee of each party. And he saw that was going to be disastrous, that it would lead to a media circus, and that it would generate corruption in the selection process, and ultimately it would pave the way to somebody completely unqualified and potentially tyrannical.
Go figure.
I find it interesting that a couple of the points of Hunter Thompson's life were failures. You could say that he failed pretty badly in covering the Vietnam War, which one would think, from this perspective, would have been a home run for him. And of course, he failed numerically in the Pittman County Sheriff's race, lost, although he brought a great deal of change to Aspen after that race, because he only lost by a couple of hundred votes out of several thousand cast. So I'd like to get your take on here he was sent to Vietnam and just kind of whiffed.
Yeah, that is a difficult one to answer. I was looking for an opportunity to promote my unauthorized Hunter S Thompson coloring book.
That was quite the segue.
The book contains a proto-graphic biography, riffs on the iconic Hunter S Thompson, as well as a tour of great art with Hunter S Thompson as a guide. And so when it came to Vietnam, I was sort of left with this image of of him just sort of railing against bombing in a few places, but he didn't take it up as a cross. You know, that was not the hill he was going to die on, even though it's a terrible metaphor for that subject. But it was part of a complex of dysfunctions that he
Yeah, I would just like, I'm sorry,
No, go ahead,
I just want to point out that the Freak Power candidate for sheriff, he was concerned about development, overdevelopment, and no traffic lights, and traffic congestion. That was like a big issue for him. And I also thought it was funny in his chart, that he wanted an ombudsman. And I've been an ombudsman, it's not fun. But no, I mean, he wanted an ombudsman, somebody to advocate for the citizens of that city. And everything was about revision, it was about listening to people, about being transparent, all of that stuff. And I mean, he really would have shaken that place up.
And
sounds like weird.
It always seemed
Yes,
like,
it does, it does.
it always seemed like his biggest, really, but his core political issue was he was against authoritarians.
Yes.
No matter what.
Yeah.
You know, which is why I think it would really be interesting to kind of, if he were writing today. I wonder though if he would have the same impact today because, you know, especially with cable news.
Everything's so fractured.
Well, it's such a circus. I mean, you know, he was so new and different because journalism at the time was so staid. And, you know, now in kind of this cable news environment of Fox and all this stuff, it's, you know, would he just be seen as another clown in the circus?
His voice is so original though.
Yeah.
I mean, I really think.
Well, I mean, he's a much better writer,
Yeah.
but I mean, in terms of.
So if you all had to say the lesson, because you were saying that putting this in the New York Times and people up in arms and objectivity and being old school, I mean, what's the lesson in all of this? I mean, can you write something like that in this day and age? And I'm curious what the audience thinks about it. So you all answer that, then I'm curious what the audience thinks about that. Do you look for that objectivity in reporting? And is that a thing that's in the rearview mirror now? I don't know. So everybody answer that to a degree.
I would not want to read only Hunter Thompson. I think he's part of your media diet, and I think he's somebody you can learn from, and I think you learn from people on the margins, and people on the margins are the ones, I think, who find truth first, and that's what I think he did.
Stephen?
I think fairness is the guiding light for journalists. And, you know, I think I've learned that from, you know, a dozen editors I've worked for, and also from reading a balanced diet of journalists and columnists over the years. And, you know, I mean, I think it's, to echo Pam's point, his work for me was part of the diet, and it inspired me to get into journalism and frankly to try for a short period in my career to do something like that and fail. As everyone who tries it does.
Yeah, but if somebody who worked under you came and said, I have a piece, and it went something like that, what would you do as their boss?
Show him your tattoo.
No, I mean, the struggle is
I
real.
did work under him, and I think I brought him a piece like that or two.
But no, I mean, what do you do when somebody says, here?
Well, I think it depends on what the expectation for your outlet is. Right.
If it's Leo,
And what their role is.
if
Well,
it's Leo, it's
because-
one thing. If it's WHAS TV, it's another. Am I?
That's what I'm asking.
Yeah,
Is it?
Absolutely is.
It is.
You know, I don't know if I
Who's
would-
your audience?
Right, who's your audience? I mean, it's sort of why Hunter Thompson worked for Rolling Stone and not the New York Times. You know?
Exactly.
That's fair. And I think too that when you're looking at the news today, I'm not going to beat up on news reporters today. I'm not going to do it. I think they're doing the best, especially local reporters are doing the best job they can. National reporters are doing the same because they're getting beat up enough by Trump administration and politicians and all these others. But I think to answer your question, Rachel, yes, there is a place for a Hunter Thompson, and there is the place for the first person diatribe. There is a place for folks to express their opinion, and it's all on cable news, and it's all diluted, as I think Pam said, or maybe Stephen did. That, and to me, that is perhaps a problem. Maybe it's a good thing. Maybe we've got so many voices now that we have the opportunity to go and read something or listen to somebody that is way, way out there, when we got the opportunity to listen to somebody who is what I would consider a totally objective journalist. You've got the span. The problem is, frankly, we aren't listening to it, and we are so huddled, in my personal opinion, in our own spot, watching Fox News or watching MSNBC or reading just a conservative. Yeah, exactly.
What we agree with.
What exactly we agree with, which reinforces your beliefs already. We're not willing to perhaps read the Hunter Thompson and then go listen to Rush Limbaugh, where I think in the past perhaps we were more open to that. But
Your thoughts, Tom?
Well, there are different kinds of journalists. I don't think anybody ever thought of Hunter Thompson as a news reporter.
No.
He wasn't. I mean, but because I spent a lot of years as a reporter. I spent a lot of years as an editor and a managing editor, and then I spent the last 11 as a columnist. And they're very, very different roles. And what he was doing is a lot of what columnists do, which is you look at the news, you try to get to the truth, and you can say a lot of. I mean, I spent a lot of time writing about our governor in ways that would have never made a news page. But it was things that I thought needed to be said, and just one other thing I think that made him so powerful was the way the most powerful way to get at power is to make fun of it. You can criticize one thing, but Thompson had this great way of making fun of things like having somebody screw his pants on. And if you look at the people who are really kind of effective at pointing out the absurdity of Donald Trump are the ones who don't take him seriously but kind of make fun of it in those kind of columns. And I think that kind of allows people to kind of, when you use humor and you use it effectively, it can really, shed light on truth.
I'd like to get your reactions.
Can I just add a footnote
Please.
to that subject before we move on? Print journalism is kind of an endangered species, and it's great that Rolling Stone continues to hang on by its fingernails to changes formats. But the work of Matt Taibbi in Rolling Stone continues the spirit of Hunter S. Thompson, and the same goes for his illustrator, I think his name is Victor Jurush, which is very Stedman-esque, but even better in a way, because he's just so spot on with his caricatures of political figures. So if you're unfamiliar with Taibbi and you're jonesing for a new voice like HST, then I would recommend it.
Can I plug another one? We were talking about this before we sat up here. I like Charles Pearson, Esquire. To me, he's just this fabulous political writer who evokes Thompson to me, has his own voice. But I thought it was interesting because he had a sports background too. And I think that sports writers are some of the best writers unsung. And he brings all of that great humor and pathos and anger and subjectivity to his political writing.
Does anyone
Can
have
I
any
add something
questions?
from Peanut Gallery?
Yeah, because I want you off. You have questions coming up.
I want to go back to, for one thing, that Barry said, which I think is very interesting about the 50s and the teenage culture, and how really, during that period of time, there was, for the first time, this kind of generational divide, and we were able to take a transistor radio on our bicycle and take our music and ride to the park, instead of having to listen to that great big table model radio in our parents' house. And so the 60s and the 70s kind of evolved from that. And so the same people that grew up at that point in time were looking to put their own stamp on it. And somebody like Thompson, who with his ego and his perceptiveness, if that's a word, was able to bring that all together. There is no Rolling Stone today. There is no one voice of the whole, those of us back then, we all read Rolling Stone. You all haven't even mentioned Facebook, Instagram, or any of the social media. I mean, it is a totally different playing field today. And so I think we really need to consider Thompson, were he alive today and not have wet brain, that how he would be able to be heard. because,
Could he
you know, there are people.
could he cut through it?
Right, through all the
There are
noise
people
that we have.
who listen to Hannity, who listen to Rachel Maddow, but those are still the minority, you know, we're old farts. That's the minority of the people in today's culture and today's voters. And how he could cut through and be heard that is a really interesting question, and I'm not sure he could. You mentioned somebody who I've never heard of. Because I don't read Rolling Stone anymore.
I'm thinking that Thompson would compose a wicked tweet. He'd break 40 characters.
But I-
Right,
but-
but
but-
so say he had 2 million followers and you know, one of the Kardashians has 25 million.
No, but who is the voice of the times now? And I think-
There isn't any. That's-
Right.
No, I would disagree, Charlie.
So let's ask that, I think that's a good question.
I think you've got our cartoon president. People have seen that. Have you seen Bill Maher? Have you seen, I'm drawing a blank, the 3 network talk shows that are on 11:30 every night. To a man, skewer the administration, poke that balloon, and greed heads, as Thompson used to refer to them. They do it every night. So Thompson, I think, lives on in some of those voices.
Andy Borowitz.
Yeah.
Moorhead's
Yeah.
perfect, yeah.
But like you said, millennials, my son's 23 years old, and he knows everything. Rich will tell you, he knows everything that's going on in current culture. He doesn't watch any of that stuff. He doesn't listen to any of those people. And so, and he's a very plugged in political kid.
But I think what Stephen is what book would maybe a younger kid who was your age at that same age, is there anybody who would resonate and really, I mean, kind of led you on a path? Is there anybody out there now who could do that for a young person?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's really hard to say. It's really hard. I mean, it's such a personal thing. Taibbi very much writes in that style and has the same, not the same. He has a similar perceptive ability, I think. The thing he wrote, his contribution to the culture to me, and I think he's gotten less relevant. His contribution to the culture was the financial crash, explaining the financial crash in a clear, crazy way that, you know, what was the giant,
Enron.
what's that?
Enron?
No, it was the housing crisis, and he talked about Goldman Sachs being the, what did he call it? It was like the blood funnel sucking all the blood. It was like really Thompson-esque the way he described it. Of course, it's not that catchy. I'm not remembering it, but the way he wrote about that was at once sort of breaking down to its essence a very complicated issue or set of issues, and also making fun of it in such a deep and hilarious way that I think it could connect more popularly than anything that Andrew Ross Sorkin ever wrote in the New York Times.
His piece on the NRA convention in Louisville was priceless.
Yeah.
I would say Mark Twain. I mean, read his war prayer. There's never been anything better written about.
So I've heard comparisons to Mark Twain now.
Well, I'm riding on Eric.
No, but twice.
A chance for another book?
This is QVC.
And I agree with that. Twain was a journalist, and he's remembered for, in fact, he was very gonzo in the book that he was known for in his life, which was The Innocents Abroad. Huckleberry Finn, Tom Sawyer, nobody knew anything about that. He was a worldwide celebrity from The Innocents Abroad, and that was gonzo journalism. It was, you know, it could have been subtitled Behaving Badly in Europe. But even though he's remembered for Huckleberry and Tom Sawyer, these fictional accounts, if you look at his journalism, before he became famous as a fiction writer and afterward, you know, right into his leadership of the Anti-Imperialist League in the first days of the 20th century, his essay To the Person Sitting in Darkness continues to be one of the most acerbic and incisive indictments of imperialist practice I've ever read. And it was about U.S. policy in China.
So let's say he came back today and looked at what was going on. Guesses about his observations. I know it's a pretty easy one,
Well,
but
I could shoot something.
Start yourself as a mechanic.
what about questions from our, let's get you all involved in this conversation. And Ron, you're sitting up here in the, at front, knew him. Your thoughts on what the panelists are saying, comparing him to Mark Twain. Your thoughts?
It's great to listen to everybody and not be the person doing all the talking first.
You guys hear him back there?
But what are your thoughts about the comparison to Mark Twain?
I think Mark Twain, first of all, is America's greatest writer of all time, period. And Thompson certainly follows in his footsteps in so many ways. And he was pivotal in the history of literature for doing what quantum physics did for science. And pulling the rug out from under the fallacy of objectivity. And showing that everything is subjective.
Right.
And I don't care how objective you think you are, you have the emotional filters you're reporting through. And Hunter recognized that. And he wrote about it. And he wrote about it in such a delightful and astute manner. So his intelligence, his razor-sharp wit, even if he was writing today, as he did from 64 to 73, in his prime, was Timothy DeNevy in his new book, which is the best book on Hunter's literary life, points out that he would be as important today if he were in that frame, state of mind, as he would be leading the pack today. That's my feeling on the subject. And going back to, he was a crook. It was a great honor to me. So this is my first visit to the museum to see this exhibit in the kitchen. I stood in the kitchen in '95, published He Was a Crook in my Ocean Heaven poster series. And Hunter loved, he wanted me to read it to him. There's a photo of me reading the poster to him. And he signed copies, and he said, here, I want you to send this to Sergeant Shriver. He's the only person who praised my Nixon obituary. It's like, you're bringing that up, you brought those memories back to me.
That's good. That's great.
Well, you know, he was so iconoclastic. And honestly, I don't think we'd be talking about him if he had just been a crazy writer or just a good writer. It was because he did hit on so many things that were true and are still true, and started conversations then that we're still having,
Sure.
and that they're not over. And I think if Mark Twain came back, he would just say nothing has changed. That's what I think he would
Oh,
say.
yeah.
I think,
Came back,
yeah, I think that the, yeah.
And I want to piggyback on something you just said, which is about objectivity. I spent something like 50 years in journalism, print, radio, TV. And if somebody said, well, you're not being objective, my response always has been, there is no such thing as objectivity. You know, you make a subjective decision to cover one story, that is, you're already non-objective. But there is fairness. I think we have an obligation as journalists to be fair. I think Thompson was more than fair. You know, an inspiration in a lot of ways to those of us who came shortly thereafter.
You know, I think objectivity is so misunderstood.
So overrated.
Well, I think it's misunderstood, though, in terms of kind of the purpose of objectivity in journalism. And the best kind of analogy I've ever seen about it is it's kind of like the scientific method that researchers use. You know, it's not, they don't come with a blank slate saying, inform me, but they say they have a hypothesis. And they test their hypothesis, you know, and they try to poke holes in their hypothesis to get to the truth. And I think that's what good objectivity in journalism, it's fairness, but it's also trying to get to the truth without kind of taking shortcuts based on bias.
I would also like to, to point out, you know, we just went through the 75th D-Day anniversary, and I was inspired to go back and read some of Ernie Pyle's work on that day and the days that followed. Nobody would say Ernie Pyle was not a journalist. The IU School of Journalism is the Ernie Pyle School of Journalism. But to say that he was objective in crawling over dead bodies on the beaches in Normandy would be 100% wrong. He was subjective, and we are the better for what he wrote, and we're the better for what HST wrote.
I think part of the issue with objectivity right now is the way we understand it is in part the result of it being weaponized over the years by politicians and others who have an interest in grinding against media, right?
Right.
I mean, you can get down to the level that I've been subject to this kind of discussion with, what I'm sure all of us have, or a lot of everybody's journalist has up here, which is, you know, well, you talk to two people who agree with that and one who agrees with that, and therefore you're not being objective, right? That's the weaponization of objectivity, in my opinion. It is sort of having a simple, cheap kind of scorecard approach to journalism as opposed to being led by fairness and truth.
There was something on Facebook the other night, and the person was asking me a question, and I said, you know, to me with this, it kind of started with the inauguration, when the comment was made, it's the biggest crowd.
Yeah.
And then we saw the photographs. And as a journalist, you have to look at the photographs, you have to look at the comment, and therein lies the problem. You have to call it and say, it wasn't the biggest. And then it became a personal attack, and then I mean, I really believe, and that's where I say to people, well, you have to get to the truth. And is that being objective? You look at the pictures? I don't know. I mean, that's to me the conundrum of a lot of this.
My friend Glenn Kessler, the fact checker at the Washington Post, got to be the hardest working man. The guy who awards Pinocchio.
But questions from you all, then I want to end with what he got right, what he got wrong.
Can I just, I'm going to try to keep this short, but this is based on something I saw in the thing about a conversation he started about women and their bodies and what is obscene and what is not obscene. And there's the picture, there's the picture of the woman. You can't see her bits. She's covered herself, but she's clearly naked. And he got a lot of criticism for running this in one of his campaign things. And his point was, and they ran a picture of the bodies of My Lai, saying, you know, the Life magazine and New York Times are running these pictures. What is the obscenity here? Is it her body, or is it the fact that we killed all of these civilians? Well, anyway, I saw that, and it reminded me of a story that is happening now. And it involves the woman, you remember the napalm girl in that very famous photo? Her name is Kim Fu. And she goes around and does lectures now. She was recently in Sarasota, Florida. And they did a story on her in advance of her coming. And the newspaper, which is a Pulitzer Prize-winning newspaper, they won 2 Pulitzers in the last 6 years, would not run the photo because she was naked. And I'm thinking, and I'm seeing this photo here, and I'm going, what is the obscenity? Is it that this little girl is naked, or that the South Vietnamese, our allies, dropped napalm on her and burned her clothes off? I mean, I just think that the point that he brought up here very poignantly is still getting played out now. Same thing, same more. And it just stunned me that I saw this here, knowing this other thing that's going on.
How about questions from the audience? You all have to have some with this. Anybody?
I'll go.
Yeah.
The Nixon letter, Nixon really quick. When you started reading about how he's saying I should be objective, but I don't think I'm going to be, or just talking about how calling him scum and nice that thing wouldn't be, you know, my immediate reaction is, you know, thinking about Nixon is that's how I feel, though.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just kind of curious, like, as you in journalism, do you ever feel sort of handcuffed by not being able to sort of maybe walk kind of, you know, you have Hunter Thompson extreme, and then you have, you know, this objective media, whatever, you know, wherever you're trying to get your message across. And the reason it sort of was sparked is because I just think, you know, you talk about Nixon sort of using the system really well, and now I feel like people now, you hear people talking about an audience for one or something, or how Donald Trump has sort of used it back. He's using it, and so the media has to cover it and put it out there, but they can't. Sometimes I feel like they might be handcuffed, and I think that, I just wanted to, that's a
Well, more and more,
frustration.
I think you see reporters saying this isn't true.
Well,
I've heard that
and
more and more.
I saw this, I think, Stephen, you might have brought this up, maybe Pam did earlier, that there are more and more, there was something, maybe ProPublica or somebody, Lee Pointer, I think had something the other day that said more and more news magazines and news outlets and TV stations are just calling it a lie. They're just using the word lie, which
I heard that on
rare.
the network
Yeah.
recently, and I was jaw-dropped because
Which
I
you
never
rarely
really
hear.
heard, I had never
Yeah.
really heard that, and I'm hearing that more and more and more now.
Right. But to answer your question, when I was a reporter, I covered 7 different governors, okay? And I was in Frankfurt all the time. Wallace Wilkinson, I don't know if you all remember Wallace Wilkinson, God rest his soul. He might have been my favorite governor to cover. He and everyone in Frankfurt knew, including me, that he was corrupt as hell. I mean, I had a story that I was getting ready to run of an architect here in Louisville who was told that he would not get any state contracts unless he brought $20,000 in cash and laid it on the desk of the finance secretary in Frankfurt. The guy was going to talk to me, backed off at the last minute because he thought he'd lose business forever. But so everybody knew, and I knew, every time that I talked to Wallace Wilkinson, that he was this corrupt guy. But, you know, I had to put that back in the bag and just cover the stories as they happen. And so yes, there's always that in the back of the mind of the reporters, that you know so much more about a person you're interviewing or what's going on than you can ever talk about, because you can't prove it and it's not out there. If you're, you
But
know,
a columnist,
but a columnist.
Well, that was,
there is a
but one of
difference.
the things that I'm most thankful about in my career is that before things got really crazy, I became a columnist.
Yeah.
And so, you know, when Trump lied, or, you know, Bevan did something stupid, which happened several times a week, I could kind of call it like I saw it. And, you know, it was always fact-based, and, you know, as long as you know, you get your facts straight, it's clearly an opinion piece, and it makes, I think it's a lot easier to get to the truth as a columnist than it is as a reporter.
That's
But
right.
what happens to your credibility if you have a leader who lies all the time and you never say he's lying?
Well, I think,
Nobody's going to believe you.
I think what you brought up and what you chimed in on is that we used to say what the president said may not agree with these particular facts, but now that we're just coming out saying he lied. That's the difference. It's in a less toxic atmosphere. We might have said the president said this. However, we must point out that
I think it started that way.
Yes, it did. And then
Well,
now
we've never had a
we're saying, well,
president
that's
do
just
it.
not true.
You
Never
better
had a
make sure you know it's a lie, though,
Well, right.
before you say that.
Absolutely. Yeah, great.
Is that the media's blowback to the attack on there being facts versus everything is merely an opinion?
What do you mean? What? You mean the attacks of fake news and
Yeah,
enemy of the people and
Fake
stuff?
news, my facts, your facts, so forth.
Alternative
Yeah.
facts.
Alternative facts.
We're only going to follow that path so far, and there are some facts.
I don't think it's personal. I think it is so egregious that there is no choice but to say what is going on and what is a lie and what may be a fudging. But I don't think it's personal at all, no. We get called the worst names in the world.
I think what you're seeing is more and more journalists and news organizations standing up and pushing back against that, which is really important because, say you do a piece that points out a lie, well, that immediately gets thrown back in your face and you're sort of boxed in this place where you know, all I do is report the facts and that's not a fact. And well, you know, you're getting this torrent of criticism. So it's important to fight back. You see the national organizations doing that. Not. And that's advocacy for truth, and it's advocacy for fact-based journalism. It's not advocacy against a president or a political party.
But you will see, though, in those arenas when they're, you know, I mean, the pushback against the press, would you all say it's more now than it ever has been?
I think
I
it's
don't
more
know.
from certain segments. I mean, I think you have a certain segment that is pushing back, but As an opinionated columnist, a pretty liberal columnist in a conservative state, I got a lot of flack, but I got a lot more supportive email than I got flack. And I think people appreciate, and I think in many ways they appreciate more than they have in a long time, the kind of the fact-based, truth-telling journalism. And it's kind of like Marty Barron, the editor of the Washington Post, kind of famously said in an interview when, he said, are you at war with the Trump administration? He says, no, we're not at war, we're at work. And that's.
Anybody else? Yes?
Yeah,
Up there.
I'd be interested in
Oh.
hearing what you all read to try to get some balance.
I listen to a lot of NPR. I actually try to minimize my daily news sources because I think it's overwhelming to try and keep up with the onslaught of information that's out there. I listen to the radio and some podcasts. I read the New York Times, I read the Washington Post, I read the Courier Journal. And, beyond that, there's plenty of daily news in those sources.
Well, I retired 3 months ago, so I don't do quite as much as I did, but I read the New York Times, Washington Post, the Courier Journal, the Herald Leader. But I also, read the New Yorker, a lot of magazines, a lot online, and I also kind of generally go to foxnews.com. I don't have cable TV at home. We pulled the plug several years ago, but I will go to foxnews.com a couple of times a day and look at how they're reporting things and how, if you want to kind of get a really alternative worldview, that's good.
I should add that I see Fox stuff through my Apple News app or whatever, and it's interesting.
But I find it very instructive though, because that's one of the things. Even as a columnist, you were trying to figure out, okay, what argument are people going to come back at me with? You want to have your facts straight, but it's really a process. Okay, this is what I think, but you try to test it, and that's kind of, I think, what you've got to do as a reader. The way journalism has changed is editors used to be called gatekeepers. And the former boss of mine, I think, was Zero, and he said, the problem with the whole gatekeepers concept is somebody took down all the fences. And so, you no longer can it's a lot more about brand name journalism, and it's a lot more about reading widely and really testing facts for yourself. And that's why a lot of these organizations like the News Literacy Project and other kind of efforts to teach people, and especially young people, about news literacy, I think are really kind of key, because you're really in a market where it's consumer beware. You don't have just news coming from trusted sources like the newspapers or WHAS or things that used to be kind of considered gold standards in journalism.
Well, I'm sorry.
Oh, no.
We're in a different,
We'll get you.
altogether different universe now. We've never been in a situation like we're in now, where officials of our country are telling us untruths. And what are we supposed to do about that? And, we kind of got blindsided as journalists by this sort of thing. Now there are no more White House briefings, which are critically important for national
What was
reporters.
the point?
Well, that's true.
They were just lying.
But we got caught with our clothes off, and now we have to start putting them on and recovering from the kinds of things that we've never had an adversarial relationship with the national government the way that we have
Well,
now.
I think the Nixon years were pretty good.
Well, yeah, but then he was gone, And
Well,
so,
it's a different landscape. Can you remember in the Nixon years, what talk radio was Milton Nets? And, since it has been Rush Limbaugh, it's like,
You got 40% of your people getting the majority of their news from Facebook. Think about that. Now, there may be links to BBC or something like that, or CNN that they're getting their news from, but a lot of it is just garbage out there that they're just, again, as I said before, reinforcing their views that they already have. Because all your Facebook friends these days, if you're conservative, all your buddies are Trump supporters, and if you're an ultra-liberal, all your buddies are, on the left. And I blame, as certainly I don't blame journalism, because I think journalists are doing the best they can with what they've got. I blame Americans.
Everybody's got a soapbox.
I blame Americans because we haven't agreed, we no longer agree on a set of facts, and we're no longer searching for that set of facts that we can debate honestly with each other.
That's true.
And it's us, it's not reporters, it's not politicians. To me, it's the Americans are not weeding through all this trash that's out there, searching for facts.
Wait until those videos come up that look like
Yeah.
people actually saying
Yeah.
stuff they didn't
Yeah.
say.
Yeah.
That's,
In the
Let
19th
me just
century,
add a
This
short
poor guy's waiting
citation
for half an
in
hour.
response to her question.
And
In
then
addition to
I
Rolling
swear this gentleman back there, we're gonna get to.
Just a couple of questions,
Yeah.
just a couple of magazines. Harper's Monthly has been doing a great job for 170 years, and Vanity Fair is really underrated as a news source.
I totally
BBC
agree.
America.
Where and when would you say Hunter's really good work ended?
What was you say?
when did
Where
it
and
go
when?
around?
I agree with Mr. Whitehead's estimate of his prime years being 64 to 70.
Any other comments?
No, I think that says it.
Well, there was chemistry involved after that, and I think that deeply affected his ability to write.
One thing I said that we would answer in this panel, what he got right and what he got wrong. So let's go down the line of what you think he got right and what he got wrong.
Well, what he got right's obvious, I think, that we're still where we were 40 years ago, politically at least. The other thing that I just thought was interesting, and I knew a little about his race for sheriff, but not a lot until I came down and looked through all this stuff. He got marijuana in Colorado. It's the first state that legalized marijuana. What was his main platform? One of the main things in his platform when he ran for sheriff was decriminalizing all drugs. And so there you go. You got that one right.
Yeah, I think, he got a lot of political issues right in terms of finding the truth that in kind of politics where it really got to the core of the American soul, which, hasn't really changed a lot. Mark Twain referred to, he said Congress was America's only indigenous criminal class. So some things have to change. But I think in terms of what he got wrong, I think a lot of the kind of the substance abuse and drug culture and things that kind of influenced him and ultimately ruined him, I think it's kind of less funny now. And in a nation with a huge opioid epidemic, and I think that that was really radical counterculture now, and I think that would be seen a lot different.
Yeah, I've already run down my list of prophecies chronologically. I would just add that he was unable to control what GONZO meant. GONZO is a pretty open term, and it's yielded itself to some pretty facile usage. I was struck by reading, of course, the USA Today, the authoritative voice of the society. On the 22nd of May, a searing review of Booksmart, a movie in the same vein as Lady Bird. It describes one of the characters, Gigi, played by Billy Lord, is a gonzo rich girl who has an affection for Amy, played by Hebert. It says, Billy Lord steals the entire movie as Gonzo Gigi, a wealthy, vice-laden misfit. So I'm not sure what Gonzo means anymore after reading that. So I'll leave it there.
I think we've gone over what he got right pretty thoroughly. I think two things. Just to echo what you said about the sort of cartoonish drug-addled piece of it, I think that overshadowed the seriousness of his work and led a lot of people to embrace the kind of Johnny Depp version of him, as opposed to the person who's represented on these walls around here right now, which I think is two very different personas. Yeah, Uncle Duke, right? And then the other miss, I don't think he was a very good novelist. Like, I don't know. He wanted to be a novelist. He wrote at least one that we can all read. It's not that good. So I think he quickly set himself on the right path.
Well, he shaved his head before anybody else did. You got that right. It's a big fashion thing now. That's pretty remarkable. I think the thing that gets to me, and they mentioned it in the ad, was that he was a moralist posing as an immoralist. And Nixon, and I would say our current occupant, are immoralists posing as moralists. And I think that he, and I do think he was very passionate and patriotic in his own way. I think he loved his country, and I think he wanted people to do and be better. And if you go over there on that wall, the first thing, he came in third in that magazine thing at his high school, but the opening line is "Young people of America, awake from your slumber." That was the first line of his magazine article. He never stopped doing that, and I think that's remarkable. And I think the thing that he got wrong was growing old with wisdom and grace, and I'm really sorry that he didn't have that. So,
Ron?
I'd like to say, in Hunter's defense, that in regards to his use of drugs and alcohol being central to his inevitable demise, self-inflicted gunshot, he was a hypersensitive, poetically spirited soul, and to hang out with him, you became aware of that. He saw deep into things and people, into life, and he was able to express what he saw. The pain that he experienced as a youth, as a person, was deep, and it finally overwhelmed him. And that's why the period was brief, where he was right on target. And I think it's a mistake to discredit him, because his entire life wasn't like those 9 years. I mean, my God.
I think we were saying those 9 years were a real gift.
They were.
Yeah.
No, I hear that. So I think, I told students many times, I told Hunter, each generation that you will tell, and I said, look, what do you think about Mozart? Have you read his biography? Do you know, other than the movie, the great movie, he was a juvenile delinquent, like Hunter. Look at the work. If we didn't know anything about his life at all, and we just had his work, think of Hunter that way. We just had his work. We didn't know anything about his life at all. He's a great writer. He's a visionary. He is a prophet. He changed our lives.
Everybody up here, do you want to wrap it up, Mr. Bernson?
I would only say that, we await the coming of another prophet like Hunter S. Thompson in our time. Perhaps he is among us in many, many different voices, given the way the media operates now. But the candle that he lit still burns, and I think for that we can all be grateful.
And stick around, you can see Stephen George's tattoo.
Today, there's only 7 copies, but if anybody wants a coloring book, it's a tour through art history. There he is, Hunter bound like Prometheus, Hunter as Medusa, like Caravaggio. So it doubles as art history. 20 bucks a piece if you're interested.
Thank you all for coming tonight.